On a cold, overcast day in Manchester in 2003, 14-year-old John had no idea his life would soon change forever. A teenager caught in the web of his own despair, he had spent months weaving a fictional world online, an intricate tapestry of lies, identities, and manipulation. On the surface, John was an ordinary boy, struggling through the familiar challenges of adolescence. But beneath that surface, a darker story was taking shape. It started innocently enough. A computer, a keyboard, an escape into the limitless anonymity of the internet. Here, John wasn't just a boy living in the shadow of his depression. He could be anyone braver, stronger, more in control. And so, the personas began to emerge. One by one, they came to life: the protector, the villain, the friend, and even the victim. Each character played their part in a story John crafted with meticulous care. But this wasn't a story meant to entertain. It was a story with a deadly conclusion. Then there was Mark, John's best friend. At 16 years old, Mark was the kind of friend who would do anything for someone he cared about. Loyal to a fault and searching for meaning in his own life, Mark had no idea that he was being drawn into something far beyond his comprehension. Their friendship, once a source of comfort and connection, was slowly becoming the stage for an unimaginable act. The plan began to unfold through cryptic online messages. John, using one of his many fabricated identities, planted the idea in Mark's mind, an idea so unthinkable, it should have sent alarm bells ringing. But it didn't. Instead, Mark became a willing participant in what he believed was a heroic mission, orchestrated by a stranger he thought he could trust. The truth was far more devastating. Every word, every instruction, every piece of the puzzle came from John himself. In the early hours of June 29, 2003, the plan was set in motion. Mark walked the empty streets of Greater Manchester, clutching a knife, his heart racing as he approached the agreed location. Unaware that the target of the attack, the boy he was about to stab, was the very person who had lured him into this terrifying act. But this was no ordinary crime. It was a moment that would shock a nation, a moment that would leave police, psychologists, and legal experts grappling with questions they had never faced before. How does a 14-year-old convince his best friend to kill him? What pushes someone to orchestrate their own attempted murder? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what happens when you survive? This is the story of John and Mark, a story of betrayal, manipulation, and survival. A case so unique, it would go down in British history as one of the strangest crimes ever committed. And it all began with a simple message in an online chat room. To understand the events that unfolded in 2003, we first need to understand the lives of the two boys at the center of this story: 14-year-old John and his best friend, 16-year-old Mark. Their bond was forged in the unremarkable routines of suburban Manchester, but beneath their friendship lay struggles neither fully understood. John's life was not extraordinary on the surface. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, he was known by classmates and teachers as polite but quiet, withdrawn even. At home, things were no better. His parents, though caring, often struggled to connect with their son, who seemed to retreat further into himself as the years went by. Behind closed doors, John wrestled with a darkness he couldn't articulate. Depression had taken hold of him, filling his days with a relentless numbness. The world around him felt unkind, unpredictable, and overwhelming. But online, things were different. The internet offered an escape, a place where he could control his narrative, create his world, and finally feel like he mattered. By the early 2000s, chat rooms and forums had become a refuge for many young people like John. He wasn't just a user, he was a creator. Logging on late at night, John adopted new personas, each more elaborate than the last. There was Rachel, a compassionate but mysterious figure. There was Kevin, a confident and assertive protector. And then there was the most tragic of them all, John himself, reimagined as a victim who needed saving. Through these identities, he built a world where he was the center, where people cared, and where he finally felt in control. But this was not an innocent game. Over time, the personas became more than just characters. They became tools, weapons he would wield to manipulate those closest to him. Mark, on the other hand, was a boy who wore his heart on his sleeve. At 16, he was friendly and eager to please, but he struggled to find his place in the world. Described by those who knew him as loyal and trusting, Mark often sought validation from those around him. And in John, he found a friend who seemed to value him unconditionally. But Mark was also vulnerable. His home life was stable but unremarkable, leaving him craving a sense of purpose. When John began sharing stories from his online world, Mark was captivated. To him, John wasn't just a friend, he was someone worth protecting, someone who made him feel needed. Little did Mark know, this loyalty would be tested in ways he could never imagine. In 2003, Manchester was a city on the rise. Known for its industrial heritage and vibrant cultural scene, it was a place of contrasts. Modern skyscrapers stood alongside historic mills, and bustling markets gave way to quiet suburban streets. For John and Mark, these streets were home, familiar yet filled with untapped potential. But behind closed doors, a quieter revolution was taking place. The internet was still in its infancy, but for teenagers like John, it was a world of endless possibilities. Chat rooms, forums, and instant messaging became new arenas for connection, exploration, and, for some, deception. The anonymity these platforms provided allowed users to step into roles they could never play in real life. For John, this anonymity wasn't just a feature, it was a lifeline. John wasn't the only one crafting an alternate reality. Across the world, millions were experimenting with personas online, often harmlessly. But in John's case, these personas served a deeper purpose. They gave him the control he felt he lacked in his real life, and through them, he began to weave a story that would pull Mark into his orbit. The early 2000s marked a pivotal time in the history of the internet. It was an era when chat rooms and message boards thrived, unregulated and unrestricted. Users could be anyone they wanted to be, often adopting new names, personalities, and even entire backstories. For some, this was a harmless exercise in creativity. For others, like John, it became something far more sinister. John's personas weren't just characters, they were tools of manipulation. Rachel was kind and empathetic, someone Mark trusted implicitly. Kevin was authoritative and commanding, someone who could issue orders with unquestioned authority. And then there was John himself, portrayed as a victim so desperate for help that Mark felt compelled to act. Over the course of months, John used these personas to create a narrative that seemed entirely real to Mark. Messages filled with urgency, threats, and promises blurred the lines between fiction and reality. And as the lies grew more elaborate, Mark became increasingly ensnared in a world he couldn't see was false. By the spring of 2003, the stage was set. Two boys, bound by friendship, were now players in a story that neither fully understood. For John, this was a desperate cry for help disguised as a meticulously crafted plan. For Mark, it was the ultimate test of loyalty. And for the world, it would soon become a case that defied comprehension. What happened next would change their lives forever. In the early 2000s, the internet was a world of anonymity and endless possibilities. It was a time before social media dominated every aspect of life, and before digital footprints became permanent. For teenagers like John, this freedom was intoxicating. Chat rooms, instant messaging services, and message boards weren't just places to kill time, they were places to become whoever you wanted to be. The concept of online personas was nothing new, but in the early 2000s, they were becoming a pivotal tool for young people searching for meaning and identity in their lives. What made John's experience so chilling was that, unlike most, his personas weren't just masks he wore for fun or escape. These were elaborate characters, each with distinct personalities, motivations, and goals. The internet had granted John the ability to live a double life, one that no one in his immediate circle could penetrate. It was a life of control, of power, and most dangerously of manipulation. For John, the personas were an opportunity to experiment with power and vulnerability. There was Rachel, a fragile figure, seeking companionship, often falling into roles of submission. Rachel was designed to appeal to Mark's sense of protectiveness, the perfect archetype for the friend who needed saving. Then there was Kevin, confident, assertive, and always in control. Kevin served as an authoritative figure, someone who could issue commands and instruct Mark on what he needed to do. And, finally, there was John himself, cast as the ultimate victim, a boy so helpless, so desperate for help, that he could do nothing but rely on others. These personas did not simply coexist, they interacted. John used them strategically, weaving a complex narrative where each persona spoke to Mark in different ways. Rachel would confide in Mark, telling him that John, as a person, was sinking deeper into depression. Kevin would push Mark further, telling him that the only way to save John was to take drastic action. These voices, though not real, became real to Mark. They became the voices he heard in the silence of his bedroom, the voices that filled the space between him and the boy he considered his closest friend. It was during this period, as the personas began to intertwine, that the online deception escalated. John's conversations with Mark became more frequent and intense. What started as simple chats about school and life quickly turned into darker, more sinister exchanges. Rachel told Mark of John's struggles, portraying him as a boy spiraling into a hopeless state. Kevin told Mark that there was no other way to help John, he had to take control, he had to act. And all the while, John remained the center of this web of lies, silently watching as Mark was slowly drawn deeper into the narrative he had created. The messages began to shift from vague suggestions to clear, unmistakable instructions. If you want to save him, you have to do something. You're the only one who can help him. Those words were repeated in different variations, in different messages, until Mark, unable to separate reality from fiction, believed them as gospel. At first, Mark was reluctant. He questioned the plausibility of the suggestion. How could he, a 16-year-old, possibly take the life of his best friend? But the messages kept coming. And they didn't just come from Rachel or Kevin, they came from John himself. John's own fabricated identity, the one that portrayed him as vulnerable and broken, continued to plead for help, subtly pushing Mark towards the idea of murder as a solution. The line between fiction and reality had completely blurred. By late June, the plan was clear. John had convinced Mark that he was the only person who could stop John from falling into the abyss. It wasn't enough to save him with kind words or gestures. Mark had to act. The murder plot had become the final, twisted answer to John's suffering. Mark, the loyal friend, had been manipulated to believe that the only way to save John was to end his life. And so, the details of the plot began to form. Through late-night chats and cryptic messages, John instructed Mark on exactly what to do. "It has to be in the woods," one message read. "It has to look real, but it has to fail." Mark was to wait for a moment when they were alone, when no one could stop him, and strike when John least expected it. The instructions were simple and chilling. Mark was to carry a knife and, in the midst of their conversation, strike John in the chest, pretending it was an accident. "You have to do this for me," John pleaded through his many personas. "I don't want to live anymore. You're the only one who can stop me." The more John's personas interacted with Mark, the more the plan solidified. The messages grew more insistent. "It's time," one message said. "This is the only way." John had manipulated every detail. His personas pushed Mark further into this web, creating a false sense of purpose that Mark, desperate to prove his loyalty, couldn't resist. And then, on June 29, 2003, it all came to a head. The day had arrived. Mark stood on the doorstep, gripping the knife, his hands shaking with a mix of anticipation and fear. He had been prepared for this moment for weeks, perhaps even months, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of what he was about to do. The plan was simple, too simple. The meeting spot was agreed upon, the time was set, and Mark was ready to carry out the act of mercy. But as he made his way toward the woods that day, something began to feel wrong. Was this really the only way? Did John really want this to happen? These questions too late began to eat away at him. But it was too late for doubt. Mark confronted John in the quiet, isolated area where they had arranged to meet. The air was heavy, the sounds of the city nowhere to be heard. They talked briefly. And then, as the plan had been outlined, Mark moved in. But there, in that moment of tension, Mark hesitated. The knife was raised but Mark faltered. And that was when John did something unexpected. He lunged forward, throwing himself into the path of the blade, a final act of desperation. But the blow, meant to end his life, did not go as planned. The plan failed. June 29, 2003. What began as a quiet summer day in Manchester would soon descend into chaos and disbelief. In a secluded wooded area, 14-year-old John lay bleeding from a stab wound to his chest. Over him stood his 16-year-old best friend, Mark, gripping the knife with trembling hands. For a brief moment, time stood still. John gasped for air, and Mark stared in horror at what he had just done. The attack was swift but not fatal. The blade missed John's heart by millimeters, a stroke of luck or fate that would unravel a story far stranger than anyone could have imagined. As John writhed on the ground, blood pooling around him, Mark panicked. He called for help, his voice shaky, repeating the same words over and over, "I didn't want to do it. He made me do it." Paramedics arrived quickly, stabilizing John and rushing him to the hospital. Mark was taken into custody at the scene, bewildered and visibly shaken. Initially, the police treated the case as an assault, an all too common story of a friendship turned violent. But what they would uncover in the coming days would leave even seasoned detectives stunned. John's injury, though serious, was not life-threatening. At the hospital, he underwent emergency surgery and soon regained consciousness. Meanwhile, Mark was brought to the police station for questioning. He remained cooperative but visibly distraught, repeatedly insisting that he had no choice, that he had been following instructions. The police were initially skeptical. To them, Mark's claim seemed like an attempt to deflect blame. But something about his story didn't sit right. Why would a boy so clearly devastated by his actions claim he was following orders? And more importantly, who was giving those orders? As investigators began piecing together the events leading up to the attack, they discovered a trail of digital breadcrumbs, chat logs, emails, and message board posts that painted a far more complex picture. This was not a random act of violence, nor was it a simple betrayal between friends. This was something entirely different. It began with John's accounts on various online platforms. As investigators delved into his computer, they unearthed a web of fabricated identities. Each persona was meticulously crafted, complete with unique writing styles, backstories, and relationships. Rachel, Kevin, the countless other usernames. Together, they formed a network of voices, all controlled by John. The chat logs revealed a disturbing narrative. For months, John had been manipulating Mark through these personas, creating an elaborate fiction in which Mark was the hero and John was the victim in desperate need of saving. One message from Kevin stood out: "You must do this. If you don't, it will be your fault when he's gone." Another from Rachel read: "Mark, you're the only one who can help him. Don't fail him now." As investigators read through the transcripts, the true nature of the crime began to take shape. This was not a case of a friend turning on another out of anger or jealousy. This was a calculated act orchestrated by the victim himself. John had written every message, played every role, and manipulated Mark into believing he had no choice but to commit the ultimate act of loyalty. The initial theories were predictable. Police first suspected a random attack, a mugging, or perhaps a fight that had gone too far. But Mark's unwavering insistence on the involvement of these mysterious personas complicated things. Could this have been a crime of passion, fueled by an argument or unspoken tension between the boys? Investigators briefly entertained the idea. Then came the breakthrough. Digital forensic experts traced the IP addresses of the messages Mark had received, discovering they all originated from the same source, John's computer. This revelation shattered any notion of Mark being the instigator. It was John who had pulled the strings, using his personas to manipulate Mark into attempting something unthinkable, his own murder. The case took an even darker turn when detectives confronted John with their findings. At first, he denied everything, claiming the personas were real, that they had coerced both him and Mark into the plot. But the evidence was undeniable. Every message, every instruction, and every fabricated detail pointed back to John. He had orchestrated the entire plan, from the persona's interactions to the final, chilling directive that led Mark to that wooded area. For investigators, the realization was staggering. Never before had they encountered a case where the victim was also the mastermind. This wasn't just a story of manipulation, it was a story of a deeply troubled young boy who used the tools of the early internet to blur the lines between reality and fiction, pulling his best friend into a narrative of despair and deceit. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one question remained unanswered: why? Why would John go to such lengths to orchestrate his own murder? And what did he hope to achieve by dragging Mark into his world of lies? The answers to these questions would not only challenge the understanding of justice but also force society to reckon with the darker implications of the digital age. The case was far from over. And the truth was far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The trial of John and Mark captivated the United Kingdom. In the courtroom, the bizarre nature of the case took center stage: how a young boy had manipulated his best friend into attempting murder, only to emerge as both victim and perpetrator. It was a legal paradox that had never been seen before in UK history. At the heart of the case lay one critical question: could someone be held legally responsible for inciting their own murder? Mark, despite having wielded the knife, was portrayed by his defense team as a vulnerable and impressionable teenager. They argued that he had acted not out of malice but under the psychological manipulation of someone he trusted. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, emphasizing the gravity of the attack and Mark's ultimate decision to go through with it. The trial lasted weeks, with both sides presenting compelling evidence, including chat room transcripts and expert testimony on the nature of coercion and influence. But it was John's role that truly made legal history. Though he survived the attack, John was charged with inciting his own murder, a legal precedent in the United Kingdom. Prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate, calculated, and designed to use Mark as a tool for his own destruction. John's defense hinged on his mental health. His lawyers described him as a deeply troubled young man who suffered from severe depression and a distorted sense of reality. They contended that his actions, while manipulative, were a desperate cry for help rather than a premeditated crime. In the end, the jury delivered its verdict. Mark was convicted of attempted murder but received a significantly reduced sentence, taking into account his young age, remorse, and the extraordinary circumstances of the case. John, too, was found guilty not of inciting a crime against himself, but of creating the conditions that led to it. He was sentenced to a combination of rehabilitation and psychiatric care, a decision that sparked heated debate across the nation.